There was a damp patch on the ceiling of Selina's room that seemed to grow every time it rained. She used to look at that patch before going to sleep, tracing with her eyes the irregular outline that spread out like a map of some country that didn't exist. Sometimes she thought that country was the only place in the world where she could fit without having to apologize for existing. The room was at the back of the Martins family home, behind the kitchen, in a room that had previously served as a pantry and had been adapted with a narrow bed, a ceiling fan that creaked like a sick bird, and a flowered fabric curtain separating the space from the service corridor. Selina was 24 years old and had slept there since she was 16, when her mother decided she no longer needed to share a room with her sisters. Actually, it was her sisters who asked. They said they needed space, that the room was too cramped, that Selina snored. She didn't snore, but she didn't argue. She simply grabbed the pillow, the sheet with its faded daisy print, and walked to the pantry without saying a word. Her mother didn't even get up from the sofa. Selina woke up every day at 5 in the morning, not because she liked the early hours of the morning, but because it was the only time the kitchen was empty and she could make coffee without hearing her mother's comments or her sister's laughter. The old kettle hissed on the stove while she cut the bread into equal slices, setting the table with the care of someone preparing an altar. Napkins folded, cups facing the same direction, the butter on the porcelain plate her mother kept for guests, but which Selina used every day silently as a small act of rebellion that no one ever noticed. After everything was ready, I would go back to my room and wait. I waited for my mother to wake up and not say good morning. I waited for my sisters to come down and not thank me for the coffee. I waited for the sound of cutlery, the conversations, the laughter, that family sound of which she was only a shadow. The mother's name was Noemia, and she ruled the house with an authority made of sighs and disapproving glances. She had 3 daughters, Renata, the eldest, in her 30s, and possessing a beauty she herself considered her profession. Monica, the middle one, who had inherited her father's green eyes, and a talent for making everything seem easy. And Selina, the youngest, who hadn't inherited anything the family considered noteworthy. Selina had a long face, eyes that were too small according to her mother, a wide nose according to her sisters, and curly hair that stubbornly refused to be straightened. As a child, she overheard her mother say to the neighbor, thinking she wasn't around, "That one got the ugly side of the family, poor thing." The word "poor thing" stuck to her like a second skin. Her mother didn't mean it maliciously, perhaps. She said it as if observing the weather. It's going to rain, it's going to be cold, Selina is the ugly one. But Selina wasn't ugly. Selina was invisible, which is different and in many ways worse. Being ugly at least provokes a reaction, astonishment, pity, even repulsion. Being invisible provokes nothing. It's like existing at 0 volume. Selina crossed the rooms of the house as if asking permission from the very air. She spoke softly. She smiled little. When her sisters tried on clothes in the living room and asked how she looked, Selina answered honestly and was ignored. When her mother received visitors and introduced her daughters, saying, "These are my girls," Selina would stand in the corner, waiting for someone to look at her, which rarely happened. Not because she was intentionally excluded, although sometimes she was, but because there was a kind of chronic erasure in her that the family nurtured without realizing it, or realizing it and pretending not to. Selina worked in a small bookstore downtown, a poorly paid job that gave her the one thing her home didn't offer: comforting silence. Among the shelves of old and new books, she organized titles alphabetically, recommended novels to shy customers, and spent her breaks reading on the back stairs, her bare feet against the wall, the sun streaming through the high window. It was in those moments that Selina truly existed. Not the Selina from the Martins' house, the ugly daughter, the shadow, but another Selina, complete, with complex thoughts and emotions that couldn't be contained in the body her family had decided was insignificant. At the bookstore, a gentleman named So Amaro, the owner, treated her with rare kindness. He kept for her the copies with printing defects that they couldn't be sold. He asked about her day. He remembered her birthday when her own mother forgot. It was Sue Amaro who, one Tuesday afternoon when the rain lashed the sidewalks and the bookstore was empty, casually mentioned that the Drummond family was looking for a caregiver for their paternal grandfather. He said it was a temporary job. During a large celebration the family was organizing on the farm. Something between caregiver and companion, so the old man wouldn't be alone while the rest of the family received the guests. They paid well. Selina wrote down the name and phone number on a piece of paper and put it in her apron pocket without thinking much about it. That night, however, upon hearing her mother talking to her sisters about the overdue bills and the rent that would increase the following month, she took the paper out of her pocket and stared at it for a long time. The Drummond family was known in the city like a legend, from afar, with reverence and a touch of envy. Owners of lands stretching beyond the horizon, coffee and cattle farms, businesses in the capital, and a surname that opened doors before you even knocked. The patriarch, Seu Otavio, was already over 80 and lived reclusively on the main farm, surrounded by employees, but essentially alone, because his children lived in the city and his grandchildren rarely visited. The only one who maintained frequent contact was the eldest grandson, Raphael Drummond, who at 32 managed part of the family business with a seriousness that his cousins called coldness, and his aunts called heartlessness. Raphael wasn't cold. Raphael was a man who had learned early on that affection, in the Drummond family, was a currency, and that people smiled at him not for who he was, but for what he carried in his surname and in his bank account. Selina called the number the next day. A secretary answered, asked brief questions, name, age, experience, and said someone would get in touch. Selina didn't expect a call back. People like her weren't called back, but they did. A week later, an efficient female voice informed her that she had been selected for an interview at the farm. Selina hung up the phone and stood in the bookstore aisle, holding the device against her chest as if it were a letter that could disappear if she opened her hand. When she told her mother, Noemia frowned and asked, "The Drummonds? Those Drummonds?" And then she let out a short laugh, dry as a crushed leaf. "And what will they want with you?" Selina didn't answer, not because she didn't know what to say, but because any answer would fuel a debate she had already lost before she was born. Her sisters, however, heard from the other room and came to ask more. Renata, her eyes shining with an interest she never showed for her sister, wanted to know if the farm was the large one, the one near the mountains. Monica asked if the single grandson, the one who had appeared in the magazines, would be there. Selina said she didn't know, and it was true. She knew almost nothing, only that it was an interview, only that they paid well, only that she needed to go. The morning of the interview arrived with the kind of light that makes the world seem freshly washed. Selina put on her best clothes, a white cotton blouse, a brown skirt that went below the knee, closed shoes that pinched a little at the heel but were the only presentable ones. She tied her hair back with an elastic band and looked at herself in the cracked bathroom mirror. The image reflected back was the usual one. An ordinary woman, with nothing that caught her attention, nothing that provoked sighs or envy. But there was something in her eyes that morning that the mirror couldn't capture. A kind of gentle determination, like that of a river that is not in a hurry but also does not stop. The farm was a 40-minute bus ride and another 20-minute walk along a dirt road lined with coffee plantations. Selina arrived with dust on her shoes and sweat on the back of her neck, but with an erect posture and a firm gaze. The main house was a huge colonial building with a wide veranda, tall windows, and a garden that seemed to have been designed by someone who understood beauty but not necessarily coziness. Everything was too beautiful, too big, too polished. Selina felt her stomach clench, but she kept walking. She was greeted by a middle-aged woman named Donna Lourdes, the farm's housekeeper, who assessed her with a quick, precise glance, the kind of look that measures a person in 3 seconds and decides whether it's worth investing more time. Donna Lourdes apparently decided it was, because she led Selina to the living room and asked her to wait. The room had antique furniture, oil paintings, a pendulum clock that marked the time with an almost religious solemnity. Selina sat on the edge of the sofa, her hands clasped in her lap, and looked around trying to memorize every detail, not out of ambition, but out of astonishment. I had never been in a place like this. I had never imagined that places like this existed outside the books I read on the stairs of the bookstore. Sir Ottavio appeared 20 minutes later, pushed in a wheelchair by a nurse. He was a thin man, with skin wrinkled like crumpled paper and surprisingly lively eyes for someone of his age. He wore a felt hat even indoors and had his hands crossed on a checkered blanket that covered his legs. He looked at Selina without saying anything for what seemed like too long a while, and then asked, in a hoarse but firm voice, "Do you like coffee?" Selina replied that she did. He said, "Then we're off to a good start." The interview wasn't an interview in the traditional sense. Mr. Ottavio didn't ask about professional experience, references, or skills. He asked if Selina liked silence. He asked if she knew the names of trees. He asked if she had ever seen the sun rise behind a mountain. Selina answered each question honestly. Yes to silence, no to trees, yes to sunrise, but behind a building, not a mountain. Mr. Ottavio laughed, a brief laugh, like a reverse sigh, and then he said, "You stay." The girl from before knew the name of everything, but didn't look at anything. You don't know the name, but you look. That's what matters. Selina started the next day. The job was simple in theory, accompanying Sir Ottavio during the day, helping him with walks in the garden, reading to him when he asked, talking when he wanted, and remaining silent when he preferred. But in practice, it demanded something that Selina, he didn't know he possessed it in abundance. Presence. Not presence in the sense of being physically there, but in the sense of truly being there. Attentive, patient, with that rare quality of someone who listens not to respond, but to understand. Sir Ottavio, accustomed to decades of people surrounding him out of self-interest, recognized this quality immediately, the way one recognizes clean water after drinking murky water for a long time. The days piled up with the gentleness of someone stacking dry leaves. Selina arrived early, prepared Sir Ottavio's coffee the way he liked it. Strong, without sugar, in the blue cup that was the only survivor from an old set, and sat beside him on the veranda while the sun slowly rose behind the coffee plants. He spoke of things no one else wanted to hear, about his wife, who had died 15 years before, about his son who had distanced himself, about his fear of dying alone in a room full of people. Selina listened. She listened with her whole body, leaning slightly forward, her eyes fixed on his, without haste to respond, without needing to fill each silence with words. Seu Otavio, little by little, opened up like a door that had been locked for years and had finally found the right key. Not a key of force, but of perfect fit. It was in the third week that Raphael Drummond appeared at the farm. Selina was in the garden, helping Seu Otavio identify the roses. He insisted there was a yellow variety that his wife had planted decades ago, and that it should be somewhere among the flower beds. Selina searched with the attentiveness of someone looking for something precious, even though she knew the rose probably no longer existed. She heard the sound of a car and looked up to see a black SUV parked at the entrance. Raphael got out with the haste of someone who has more important places to be. He was tall, with broad shoulders, short dark hair, and an angular face that would be handsome if it weren't so closed off. He wore clothes that cost more than Selina earned in months, and walked with the confidence of someone who had never needed to ask permission to enter anywhere. He walked past Selina without looking at her. He went straight to his grandfather, bent down to kiss him on the forehead, and said something she didn't hear. His grandfather, Otavio, smiled. A different smile than the one he gave Selina, more restrained, as if saving some of his joy so as not to frighten his grandson with excessive emotion. Raphael stayed for a few minutes, talking about business, about the upcoming celebration, about the guest list. Then he stood up, looked around as if checking if everything was in order, and only then noticed Selina. He stopped. He looked at her with the same expression one uses when looking at a piece of furniture one doesn't remember buying. "And who are you?" The question wasn't rude, but it wasn't kind either. It was administrative. Selina answered her name and her job title. Raphael nodded, said something like, "Okay," and went inside. That night, Selina returned to the Martins family home and found a different atmosphere. The sisters were in the living room, dressed as if expecting someone, and their mother was wearing the dress she saved for special occasions. When Selina asked what was happening, Noemia explained that they had received a visit from one of the Drummond's aunts, Donna Eugenia, sister of Raphael's father, who was inviting well-known families from the region to the grand celebration at the farm. A gala dinner to celebrate Seu Otavio's 85th birthday, with the presence of the entire Drummond family, including relatives from São Paulo, Rio, and even Portugal. Renata and Monica had been invited by name. Their beauty was well known in the city, and Donna Eugenia, who was a friend of Noemia's, thought it would be nice to have beautiful young women among the guests, especially since there were several single Drummonds in the family. Selina listened to everything in silence. She didn't ask if she had also been invited. She didn't need to. The answer was in the way her mother spoke only of Renata and Monica, in the way her sisters discussed dresses and hairstyles without including her in the conversation, in the way her name didn't appear in any sentence. Selina went to her room, sat on the bed, looked at the stain on the ceiling, and took a deep breath. She didn't cry. It had been a long time since she had cried over things like this. The pain was no longer sharp. It was chronic, like a backache that you carry for so many years that it becomes confused with your posture. But the next day, something happened that changed everything. Noemia called Donna Eugenia to confirm her daughter's attendance, and, during the conversation, discovered that the Drummonds were having difficulty finding companions for their older relatives during dinner, ladies and gentlemen who would need someone to help them serve themselves, move around, and feel included in the party. Donna Eugenia mentioned, almost in passing, that they would pay well for it. Noemia hung up the phone with an idea she considered brilliant. She turned to Renata and Monica and said, "We'll send Selina." The sisters laughed. Monica said, "Perfect, she won't be doing anything else anyway." Renata added, "And that way at least she'll be useful for something at the party." Noemia told Selina that night, presenting the idea not as humiliation, but as an opportunity. "You'll be able to go to the party," she said, as if offering a gift. "You'll help the elderly, earn some money, and get to see the party up close. Isn't that better than staying here at home alone?" Selina looked at her mother and saw in her something she had always seen, but which that night seemed clearer. The complete inability to recognize cruelty when it comes disguised as practicality. Noemia wasn't bad. Noemia was limited. And the limitations of those we love hurt more than the wickedness of those we despise. Selina accepted. Not because she didn't understand what was happening. She understood perfectly. Her sisters would go as guests. Beautiful, well-dressed, available to be courted. She would go as a servant, useful, convenient, disposable. But she accepted because the farm was already, in a way, the only place where she felt seen. By Seu Otavio, at least. And because there was a part of her, that part that looked at the stain on the ceiling and imagined a country where she would fit, that wanted to see what it would be like to be in the same room as people who never needed to imagine countries to fit in. The weeks leading up to the celebration turned the Martins' house into a chaotic mess of fabrics, shoes, and discussions about hairstyles. Renata bought a tight red dress that cost the equivalent of 2 months' rent. Monica chose a navy blue dress with a low back that her mother pretended to disapprove of, but secretly loved. Selina didn't buy anything. Donna Lourdes informed her that she would receive a uniform, a discreet, black, functional outfit. Selina accepted without comment. When Monica asked, laughing, if she wouldn't like to lend one of her old clothes to enhance the uniform, Selina replied with such a calm smile that Monica felt embarrassed, although she didn't know exactly why. Raphael returned to the farm several times in the following weeks, always with the same haste, always with the same expression of someone carrying the weight of the world on their shoulders and considering it an obligation, not a privilege. Selina watched him from afar while caring for Seu Otavio. She noticed things that probably no one else noticed. The way he clenched his jaw when he spoke on the phone, as if swallowing words he wanted to say. The way his shoulders relaxed for a split second when he entered the veranda where his grandfather was sitting, before stiffening again. The way he looked at the distant mountains with an expression that, if Selina had to name it, she would call thirst. Not thirst for water, but for something he couldn't name and therefore couldn't find. One afternoon, Selina was reading to Seu Otavio on the veranda, a book of poems by Carlos Drummond de Andrade, a coincidence of a surname that always made the old man smile, when Raphael appeared earlier than usual. He stopped at the door and listened. Selina didn't notice his presence immediately. She was engrossed in the verses, the cadence of the words, the way her voice molded itself to the rhythm of the poem as if it had been made for it. Raphael stood there for almost a full minute. Then he cleared his throat, and Selina looked up, startled. He didn't apologize for the interruption. He simply looked at the book and said, "My grandmother used to read these poems." Selina replied, "Your grandfather asked me to." Raphael was silent for a moment, and then left without saying anything more. But that night, before leaving, he passed through the kitchen where Selina was washing Seu Otavio's blue cup, and said, without looking at her, "You read well?" Selina thanked him. He left. It was the first time he had said something that wasn't administrative. Selina didn't think much of it, or tried not to, but she kept the phrase in a quiet place inside herself, like keeping a seed without knowing if it will germinate. The day of the celebration arrived with the intensity of a predicted storm. The farm was transformed. Lights hung from the garden trees, long tables covered with white tablecloths, flowers everywhere, an orchestra setting up its instruments in a corner of the main hall. Cars began arriving in the early afternoon, unloading men in suits and women in long dresses who walked around the property as if the ground were made for them. Selina watched it all while tidying Seu Otavio's room, ironing his clothes, preparing his medicine. He was as excited as a child. He insisted on wearing the gray suit he had kept since his daughter's wedding and asked Selina to put a flower in his lapel. She chose a white rose from the garden. He held her hand for a second and said, "You are the best thing that has happened in this house in many years, girl." Selina descended to the hall, already transformed into the version the Drummond family expected of her. Black dress, hair tied back, discreet posture, ready to serve without being noticed. She met her sisters at the entrance and almost didn't recognize them. Renata, in the red dress, perfect makeup, laughing with a gray-haired man who seemed important. Monica, in navy blue, holding a champagne glass with the studied elegance of someone who had practiced in front of the mirror. They saw Selina and gave a brief wave, the kind of greeting one gives to a known employee. Selina waved back and went to her post. The evening progressed with the predictability of high society events, speeches, toasts, conversations growing louder as the wine flowed. Selina looked after Dona Fernanda, a great aunt who was deaf in one ear and complained about everything. But when Selina brought her he held her hand and said, "Thank you, darling. You're the first person tonight who treated me like a human being and not like an old piece of furniture." The plate contained exactly the things she could eat considering her dietary restrictions. It was around 10 o'clock at night when the incident that would change everything occurred. Renata, who had drunk more than she should have, was chatting with a group of Drummond cousins when one of them, a young man named Fabio, who possessed the lazy beauty and bored arrogance of the very rich and very young, asked if there were any more pretty girls in town. Renata, wanting to impress, began talking about the local families, about who was who, and at some point, driven by alcohol and the chronic need to be the center of attention, pointed to Selina, who was passing by in the background carrying a plate, and said, "That's my sister over there. Can you believe it? We sent her as an escort for the elderly couple. She wasn't going to do anything at the party anyway." The group laughed. Fabio laughed. Others laughed. The phrase circulated through the room like a cold draft, quick, invisible, cutting. Selina didn't hear the phrase, but she saw the laughter. She saw the glances that turned to her for a second before looking away. She saw Renata turning to her with that smile that was both an apology and an acknowledgement of guilt, and she understood. She didn't need to hear the words to know what had been said. She knew that script by heart. She continued working. She served water, collected dishes, helped Dona Fernanda go to the bathroom, checked if Seu Otavio was comfortable in the corner of the room where he had been settled with his blanket and hat. She did everything with the same calm as always. On the outside, nothing changed. On the inside, something tightened, like a guitar string turned one turn too far, producing a note that no one hears, but that vibrates throughout the entire body. Raphael overheard the conversation. He was close enough to catch Renata's sentence and the laughter that followed. He looked at Selina across the room and saw her continue working as if nothing had happened. And that was it. Her calmness, her unwavering dignity, her silent refusal to victimize oneself, that made something stir within him. It wasn't pity. Pity is easy. Anyone feels pity and moves on. It was recognition. Raphael looked at Selina and saw something he knew, the armor of someone who had learned to survive without complaining. He wore the same armor. His was made of expensive suits and calculated coldness. Hers was made of silence and hard work. But both served the same purpose, protecting a heart that had already been hurt too many times. Half an hour later, Selina was in the kitchen arranging the dessert plates when Raphael entered. She looked up, surprised. That space was staff territory, and no Drummond ever set foot there during a party. He stopped in the doorway, his hands in his jacket pockets, and looked at her with an expression she couldn't decipher. Then, without explanation, he picked up one of the dessert plates, examined the sweet with exaggerated attention, and said, "This one here is the best of the party." Selina looked at him, uncomprehending. He continued, "Did you arrange this?" Selina said yes, that Dona Lourdes had asked her to plate it. Raphael nodded and said, "It's perfect," and he left. The sentence itself was nothing. It's perfect. 2 ordinary words spoken casually. But Selina stood there staring at the door he had left through as if she had received an electric shock. Because she understood, not with her mind, but with that instinct that invisible people develop to survive, that he wasn't talking about the dishes. You were saying something else, something she couldn't put into words, but felt in her chest as if someone had turned on a light in a room she thought had no windows. In the days following the party, the dynamics on the farm changed in subtle ways that perhaps only Selina and Seu Otavio noticed. Raphael began to appear more often, always with practical pretexts, reviewing the farm's accounts, checking the state of the property, discussing roof maintenance with Dona Lourdes. But his pretexts had a curious tendency to lead him to the same places where Selina was. If she was on the porch with Seu Otavio, Raphael would appear to ask something, to her grandfather. If she was in the garden, he would decide he needed to walk among the flower beds. If she was in the library choosing books, he would go in looking for a document he could never find. Selina understood. She understood, and pretended not to, because she had learned from a very young age that interpreting kindness as self-interest was the quickest path to disappointment. People like her didn't receive attention from people like Raphael. That didn't happen in real life. It happened in the books she read on the bookstore stairs, in those romances where the simple girl wins the heart of the powerful man, where kindness triumphs over beauty, where love knows no class boundaries. But books were books, and life was life. And in life, Selina was the sister they sent as a joke. Raphael, for his part, didn't understand what he was feeling. He wasn't the type of man who analyzed emotions. He was the type who locked them away in a drawer and moved on. He'd had relationships before, always with women from his social circle, beautiful, sophisticated women who knew how to choose wine, talk about art, and laugh at the right jokes at the right moments. None of those relationships had lasted more than a few months. Raphael would distance himself before things got serious because at some point he always felt that familiar sensation of being observed, not as a person, but as property. Selina was different. Selina didn't look at him as property. In fact, she barely looked at him. And perhaps it was this genuine indifference, not strategic, not calculated, but true, that attracted him like a river is drawn to the sea. One morning, Mr. Otavio asked Selina to take him to the old orchard behind the house. He wanted to see the jaboticaba trees his wife had planted when they were young. Selina pushed the wheelchair along the stone path, careful of every unevenness, every root that rose from the ground. The orchard was an enchanted place. Trees twisted by time, dark fruits clinging to the trunks like jewels, the ground covered in leaves that rustled underfoot. Mr. Otavio asked her to pick some jaboticabas. Selina reached out and removed the fruits from the trunk one by one, with the delicacy of someone handling something sacred, and placed them in the old man's hand. He ate in silence, the purple broth dripping down his chin, and smiled with his eyes closed. Raphael appeared in the orchard minutes later. He said he was looking for his grandfather. Seu Otavio, with the shrewdness of the very old, said, "Sit down, boy, and taste these jabuticabas. They are still the best in the state." Raphael sat on the stone bench next to his grandfather, and Selina, without thinking, picked more fruit and offered it to him. Their fingers touched for a fraction of a second when he took the jabuticabas from her hand. Neither of them said anything. But Seu Otavio, who observed everything with those old eyes that had already seen decades of love beginning and ending, smiled in a way that neither of them noticed. That same week, Selina received an unexpected visit from Monica at the farm. Her sister appeared one Wednesday afternoon, driving a friend's borrowed car, wearing a floral dress and sunglasses that were too big for her face. She said she was just passing through, a blatant lie since the farm wasn't on the way anywhere, and asked to see the property. Selina led her through the gardens with the distant politeness she reserved for her family, answering questions without offering additional information, showing her the rooms without going into detail. But Monica wasn't interested in the gardens or the rooms. She was interested in Raphael. "I heard he's single," Monica said, taking off her sunglasses and looking at Selina with that smile that seemed casual but was meticulously calculated. Renata found out at the party. Apparently his cousins have been trying to find someone for him for years. Selina felt a cold sensation settle in her stomach, but kept a neutral expression. "And what does that have to do with me?" she asked. Monica laughed. "Nothing, of course. I'm just commenting. But it would be nice, wouldn't it, if you could introduce me, like naturally, without it seeming arranged?" Selina looked at her sister and saw with brutal clarity what was happening. Monica was asking her to be a bridge, an intermediary, the less attractive sister paving the way for the beautiful sister. Selina said she would see what she could do, not because she actually intended to facilitate the meeting, but because refusing would provoke questions, comments, and pressures that she didn't have the energy to face. When Monica left, Selina stood at the farm gate watching the car disappear down the dirt road. She felt a pain that wasn't new, but that day it came with an extra layer, the realization that even in the only place where she had begun to feel seen, the shadow of her family still reached her. Seu Otavio noticed something was wrong. That night, as Selina prepared his tea, he held her hand and said, "What's bothering you, young lady?" Selina wanted to say nothing. She wanted to smile and change the subject. But something in the old man's voice, that sincerity devoid of haste, that genuine willingness to listen, caused the dam to give way a little. Not much, just enough for her to say, "Sometimes it's hard to be the one no one chooses." So Otavio squeezed her hand and replied with the devastating simplicity of those who have lived too long to complicate things. Those not chosen by the blind are not lost, they are simply waiting for eyes that can see. Raphael didn't know about Monica's visit, but he did know about Selina's family. Dona Lourdes, who knew everything that happened on the farm and in 3 surrounding towns, mentioned in passing that Selina's sisters were beautiful and single and that they had made an impression at the party. Raphael heard this and didn't comment, but later, when he found Selina alone in the library returning a book to the shelf, he said something that caught her completely off guard. "Your sister came today." Selina confirmed it. Raphael looked at the books as if searching for a specific title and said, still without looking at her, "She wanted to meet me, didn't she?" Selina didn't answer. Her silence was more eloquent than any words. Raphael took a book from the shelf at random, looked at the cover without really reading it, and said, "I'm not interested." And he left. Selina stood still in the library, her heart pounding with an intensity that frightened her. "I'm not interested." 3 words that could mean many things. That he wasn't interested in Monica, that he wasn't interested in being introduced to anyone, that he wasn't interested in relationships, or, and this was the possibility, Selina was trying to push away as one pushes away a burning ember with bare hands. He wasn't interested because he was already looking elsewhere. The days that followed brought a new tension to the air of the farm. Not the tension of conflict, but the tension of something about to happen. Like the silence before the rain, when the sky darkens and the leaves stand still and even the birds fall silent, knowing that something big is approaching. Selina and Raphael met in the same hallways, on the same porches, in the same gardens, and each encounter lasted a little longer than the last. The conversations, which had begun with administrative phrases, evolved into comments about the weather, about coffee, about books, then into opinions. Raphael discovered that Selina had strong ideas about things he never imagined anyone could have strong ideas about, such as the correct way to prepare coffee, or the best time to read, or why certain trees grow crooked. And Selina discovered that, behind the facade of coldness, Raphael was a profoundly lonely man, surrounded by people who wanted him out of obligation or self-interest, with no one who wanted him simply because they could. One night, the power went out on the farm. A storm knocked down a power pole on the road, plunging the property into darkness. Selina was with Seu Otavio when it happened. The old man was startled, not by the darkness, but by the disorientation. He called out the name of his dead wife, confusing the times, and Selina held his hands and spoke to him softly, as if calming a river, until he returned to the present. When calm returned, Selina lit candles all over the room and sat beside the bed, reading to him by the flickering light of the flames. Raphael found her like this. Standing in the doorway of his grandfather's room, illuminated by the light from the hallway where the emergency generators were already running, he looked at the scene. Selina reading by candlelight, Seu Otavio sleeping with an expression of peace that Raphael hadn't seen in years, the shadows dancing on the walls as if telling a story. Parallel, and he felt something break inside him. Not the kind of break that destroys, the kind that opens, like a shell that cracks open so that something can be born. He entered the room quietly and sat in the armchair in the corner. Selina stopped reading and looked at him. She said nothing. He said nothing either. They remained like that for a time that neither of them measured, she with the book open in her lap, he with his elbows resting on his knees and their hands intertwined, sharing a silence that was not empty, but full of everything that neither of them knew how to say. Full of acknowledged loneliness, of walls crumbling without haste, of something that perhaps was the beginning of something, but that neither of them dared to name. It was Seu Otavio who, without opening his eyes, murmured, "Are you two going to stay there all night in silence? Or are you going to talk like normal people?" Raphael and Selina looked at each other and, for the first time, laughed together. A low, restrained laugh, like someone afraid of waking someone or scaring away their own courage. From that night on, the dam broke, not violently, but with the necessary slowness of true things. Raphael began to seek out Selina with a frequency that could no longer be justified by practical pretexts. He would appear on the veranda in the morning with 2 cups of coffee and sit beside her while Seu Otavio dozed in his chair. He didn't talk much. Raphael had never been a man of many words. But being there, beside her, sharing the silence and the rising sun, was enough. It was more than enough. It was the truest thing he had done in years. Selina received his presence with a caution that was both protective and painful. Every morning he appeared, she felt a mixture of joy and fear so intense that it physically hurt, like swallowing something too hot, warming the inside, but also burning. She wouldn't allow herself to believe it. She couldn't. Her whole life had taught her that expecting good things was the quickest path to disappointment, that people like her didn't receive attention from people like him, that the happy ending was for the sisters, for the beautiful ones, for those who were born with the right type of face, body, and presence. But Raphael kept showing up, and each day brought a small proof that it was real. Not a grand gesture, not a passionate declaration, but tiny things that only someone attentive would notice. A book he left on the balcony with a note saying, "I read this and thought of you." A coat he placed over her shoulders on a cold morning without saying anything. A question, "How was your day?" asked with such genuine attention that Selina almost cried, because no one in her entire life had ever asked that with a true desire to hear the answer. There was a moment Selina would cherish forever. She and Raphael were in the orchard, sitting on the stone bench where days before they had eaten jaboticabas with Seu Otavio. The sun was setting, and the sky had that impossible color somewhere between orange and purple, as if someone had spilled hot paint on the horizon. Raphael looked ahead at the coffee plantations, stretching to the mountains, and said, without turning around, "At the party, I heard what your sister said about you." Selina felt her whole body tense. She didn't answer. He continued, "And I kept thinking about what makes a person remain kind after being treated like that." Selina looked at her own hands and said, her voice firmer than she expected, "It's not kindness. It's a choice. I choose who I want to be. They don't choose for me." Raphael turned to her then, and for the first time, Selina saw in his eyes something she had never seen in anyone's eyes when they looked at her. Admiration. Not the kind of admiration one feels for beauty or talent or wealth, but the profound admiration one feels before something rare, before something that cannot be bought, taught, or faked. He said nothing, but he raised his hand and, with a delicacy that seemed impossible for those fingers accustomed to signing contracts and shaking hands with businessmen, brushed away a strand of hair that the wind had pushed across her face. Selina stopped breathing. Not literally, but in that way that happens when the whole world focuses on a single point. His fingertips touched the side of her face, and everything else disappeared. The orchard, the sun, the sky, the coffee plantations. Everything vanished for a second. Only that touch existed. That hand that reached her not out of pity, not out of obligation, not out of self-interest, but out of choice. For the first time in her life, someone chose to touch Selina simply because they wanted to be near her. She didn't run away. She didn't back down. She stayed there, a strand of hair now tucked behind her ear, her face turned towards him, her eyes, too small according to her mother, shining with an intensity that transformed her entire face, and she said, "Why are you here? Not here in the orchard. Here, with me." Raphael looked at her for a long moment and replied, "Because you're the first person in years who doesn't want anything from me, and I still haven't decided if that scares me or saves me." Selina smiled, not the restrained smile he used for his family, nor the polite smile he reserved for strangers. a whole smile filling his entire face, showing his imperfect teeth and the dimples that only appeared when his joy was genuine. And Raphael, looking at that smile, thought he had never seen anything so beautiful in his life. Not beautiful in the way the world uses it, symmetrical, polished, decorative. Beautiful in the way that matters. True, unexpected, impossible to ignore once you see it. But like every story that carries truth, this one also carried pain. And the pain came in the form of a phone call. Raphael's mother, Sonia Drummond, learned from his cousin Fabio, the same one who had laughed at the party, that Raphael was spending too much time on the farm and seemed interested in the young woman who cared for his grandfather. Sonia was a woman who had married into the Drummond circle and who saw the whole world as a matter of strategic alliances. She called her son with the controlled voice of someone furious but not admitting it and said, "Raphael, I've heard you're involved with an employee. One of the Martins' sisters, the ugly one." Raphael felt his blood boil, but replied with the same coldness his mother used, "So, what if I am?" Sonia laughed, a laugh identical to Noemia's when Selina told her about the interview. And Raphael realized with silent horror that, despite being from opposite social classes, the two mothers were cut from the same cloth. She said, "Don't be ridiculous, darling. You know who you are. You know who she is. The whole world will laugh at you." Raphael hung up without replying. But the connection planted a seed of doubt that Raphael didn't want to admit existed. Not doubt about Selina. About her, his certainty only grew. But doubt about himself, about whether he was strong enough to face the world around him. About whether Selina deserved to bear the weight of being the woman the Drummond family would reject. About whether the love he felt, because it was love, of that he was already certain, although the word seemed too big to say aloud, was capable of withstanding the pressure that would come from all sides. Selina noticed the change. Raphael still showed up, still brought coffee, still sat beside her in the morning silence. But something was different. A hesitation in his eyes, a millimetric distance that seemed casual, but which Selina, trained a lifetime to read between the lines of contempt, immediately recognized as retreat. She didn't ask what was wrong. It wasn't in her nature to seek explanations. If he wanted to leave, she would let him. It would hurt. It would hurt like few things in life, but she would let him. Because Selina had learned with the bitter wisdom of those who are constantly abandoned that holding on to someone who wants to leave is not love. It's desperation. And she refused to be desperate. But Seu Otavio, who saw everything from his 85 years of height, didn't have the same patience. One afternoon when Raphael came to visit him alone and was fiddling with his phone with anxious distraction, the old man said, "Boy, I'm going to die soon. Don't look at me like that. It's the truth, and I've made peace with it. But before I die, I want to tell you something your father never told you, because he never learned it either. Love isn't a business. It has no contract, no exit clause, no guaranteed return. Love is a gamble you take knowing you could lose everything. And the only thing worse than losing is never having gambled." Raphael looked at his grandfather and, for the first time since childhood, felt his eyes burn. The crisis erupted on a Thursday. Sonia Drummond showed up at the farm unannounced, accompanied by two aunts and her cousin Fabio, who seemed to be there only to watch the spectacle. Raphael's mother entered the house like a controlled hurricane, a smile on her lips, venom in her eyes, and asked to speak to her son in private. Selina was in the kitchen when she heard raised voices coming from the living room. She didn't want to listen, but the farm was old and the walls were thin, and Sonia's words pierced the hallway like knives. A maid, Raphael. A girl without education, without pedigree, without anything. The whole family will become a laughingstock. Do you want to destroy everything your grandfather built because of a crush on a girl who isn't even pretty? Selina listened to every word. She stood still in the kitchen, her hands resting on the marble countertop, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it wanted to burst out of her chest and run away, because her chest was no longer a safe place. She didn't cry, she didn't tremble. She stood there, firm, like a tree that knows the wind will pass, but feels every branch being bent. When the argument ended and the cars drove off, kicking up dust on the road, Selina made a decision. Not out of weakness, not out of defeat, but out of something she silently called true love, the kind of love that thinks of the other before itself. She didn't want to be the reason for Raphael's war. She didn't want him to have to choose between her and the world. Not because she doubted his feelings, but because she knew that carrying that weight could break something inside him that she wouldn't be able to fix. That night, she wrote a letter. Not a long letter. Selina had never been one for many words. She wrote in small handwriting on the stationery that Dona Lourdes kept in the kitchen drawer. "Raphael, I heard what your mother said. She's not wrong about who I am, but she's wrong about what that means. I'm no small thing. I just haven't found the place where I feel whole yet. Thank you for making me who I am. To feel for a few weeks that this place existed. Take care of your grandfather. He needs eyes that can see, and yours can see. Selina." She left the letter on the porch, under Seu Otavio's blue cup, and left before dawn. She walked along the dirt road in the dark, her backpack on her back and shoes pinching her heels, with the feeling that each step took her further away from something that could have been hers, but that the world didn't allow. The sky was still dark when she reached the bus stop on the highway. She sat on the concrete bench and waited. The morning chill penetrated her thin blouse, and she crossed her arms not to warm herself, but to hold on, as if her own body might fall apart if she didn't keep it together. She thought of the mornings on the porch, the coffee in the blue cup, the jaboticabas picked with fingers stained purple, Seu Otavio's voice saying, "Girl," as if saying, "treasure." She thought of Raphael's fingers brushing away a strand of hair. She thought of the question he asked in the orchard, "Why are you here?" And the answer she gave, "Because you're the first person in years who doesn't want anything from me." She thought about all of this and squeezed her arms tighter, because the pain was the kind you don't cry about. It's the kind you carry. The kind that sinks into your chest and stays there, like a weight you can't let go of because it's part of your body. The bus arrived at 6:15. Selina boarded, paid the fare with coins she took from her pocket, and sat by the window. She rested her forehead against the cold glass and watched the coffee plantations passing by outside, row after row of coffee plants aligned with a precision that seemed impossible for anything living. The farm receded into the distance, and with it, the version of Selina that had existed in recent weeks. The woman who was seen, who was heard, who was chosen. That version didn't die. Selina wouldn't let it die. But it remained stored away, like a beautiful dress carefully folded and placed at the bottom of a drawer, because there's no occasion to wear it, and looking at it every day only makes the longing worse. When she arrived home, her mother was in the kitchen preparing the coffee that Selina usually made. Noemia looked at her daughter in surprise. Selina never came back at that time, and she asked what had happened. Selina simply said, "The work on the farm was over." The mother accepted the answer without questioning, because questioning would require interest, and interest would require looking at her daughter for real. And looking at her daughter for real could reveal things that Noemia preferred not to see. Selina went to the back room, closed the flowered curtain, and lay down on the narrow bed. She looked at the stain on the ceiling. For the first time in weeks, the stain didn't look like a country. It just looked like what it was: dampness, seepage, neglect. And that realization hurt more than any words from Sonia Drummond. In the days that followed, Selina returned to the bookstore. So Amaro greeted her with his usual kindness, without asking why she had returned earlier than agreed, simply placing a copy with a printing defect on her desk, a novel she had wanted to read for months, like someone applying a bandage without mentioning the wound. Selina resumed her routine with the discipline of someone who knows that routine is sometimes the only thing that prevents the world from collapsing. She opened the bookstore, organized the books, served customers, and read on the back stairs, but the books no longer had the same appeal. The words passed before her eyes without reaching her heart. The back stairs, where she once found peace, now seemed like just a staircase. Concrete steps, a peeling wall, a high window that let in light but not warmth. Selina's departure left a void on the farm that manifested itself in unexpected ways. So Ottavio refused coffee for 3 consecutive days, saying it was bitter, even though the coffee was prepared exactly the same way. The chair where Selina sat on the porch remained empty, and no one occupied it, as if there were an invisible rule that everyone respected without knowing why. Donna Lourdes, who never got attached to temporary employees, found herself more than once setting the table with an extra cup. Raphael found the letter the following morning. He read it standing on the balcony with the sun rising behind the coffee plants and the birds singing with a joy that seemed an insult to the pain he felt. He read it once, twice, 3 times. Each reading revealed a new layer: dignity. Contained within the words was the generosity of someone who leaves so as not to cause pain to another, the pain hidden between the lines that only someone who knows how to read silences could find. He put the letter in his jacket pocket and went down to the garden, where Seu Ottavio was waiting in his wheelchair with his checkered blanket and felt hat. The old man looked at his grandson and simply said, "And now?" Raphael sat on the stone bench and looked at his hands. And now? The simplest question in the world and the most difficult to answer, because now it meant choosing. It meant deciding who he was, the heir that the Drummond family had molded him to be, or the man who had discovered in the most unexpected weeks of his life that there was someone inside him capable of true love. Raphael returned to the city that day, but he didn't go home. He went straight to the bookstore where Selina worked. So Amaro greeted him with the natural distrust of someone seeing a man in an expensive suit enter a small bookstore in a humble neighborhood. Raphael asked about Selina. So Amaro said she wasn't there, that she had asked for the day off, that she seemed sad but didn't say why, because Selina never said why. She just kept everything inside like someone who keeps books on a shelf that no one visits. Raphael left the bookstore and stood on the sidewalk, looking at the busy street, feeling more lost than he had ever felt in his life, which was ironic for someone who had always known exactly where he was on the world map. His map was made of properties, bank accounts, company names. But that map didn't point the way to Selena, to what he felt, to the version of himself that only existed when he was near her. He searched. He called numbers he could find, knocked on doors he was given, crossed neighborhoods he had never set foot in. He walked down narrow streets of terraced houses, past grocery stores where men played dominoes on the sidewalk, past beauty salons with open doors and loud music, past squares where children ran barefoot around old trees. Selena's world was this, made of concrete, of noise, a life crammed into small spaces. And Raphael, who knew the world of spacious halls and landscaped gardens, looked at all this with a newfound humility, realizing that there was more life, more truth, more humanity in those streets than in all the gala parties he had ever attended. He asked a woman selling sweets on the corner about Selena. The woman looked him up and down, his suit, his watch, his shoes that cost more than the entire stall, and said, "The girl from the bookstore? She lives up in the alley by the jaboticaba trees." And Raphael felt his chest tighten at the word jaboticaba trees, because the world is like that, full of coincidences that seem like messages. And finally, late in the afternoon, he found the Martins' house, a modest building in a tree-lined alley with peeling paint and a creaking iron gate. He rang the doorbell and waited. Noemia opened the door. Selena's mother looked at Raphael as if he were an extraterrestrial, mouth open, eyes wide, hands clutching her apron as if she didn't know what to do with them. Behind her, Renata and Monica appeared in the hallway, equally astonished. Raphael asked for Selena. Noemia stammered something incomprehensible. Monica, recovering more quickly, smiled and said, come in. She's in her room, but sit here and we'll call her." And while she said this, she fixed her hair with one hand and tugged at her blouse with the other, because Raphael Drummond's presence in the Martins' living room was the equivalent of a comet streaking across the sky. Rare, dazzling, and potentially destructive. But Raphael didn't sit down. He looked around, the cramped room, the sofa with its mismatched cushions, the old television on a Formica cabinet, and there in the back, behind the kitchen, the flowered curtain that separated Selena's room from the rest of the house. He saw the curtain and understood. He understood everything that didn't need to be said in words. He understood the depth of loneliness that fit in that narrow room. He understood why Selena was looking at the stain on the ceiling. He understood why she knew how to be invisible so perfectly. Selena appeared. She was standing in the kitchen doorway, wearing a loose t-shirt, sweatpants, and barefoot, her hair loose and falling around her face with a freedom that no hair tie could contain. She looked at Raphael as if he were a mirage, something too beautiful to be real, that would disappear if she blinked. He looked at her and felt that same certainty he had felt in the orchard, in the candlelit room, on the silent mornings on the porch, the certainty that he was exactly where he should be. He said, "I read your letter." She said, "I know." He said, "You were wrong." She frowned. He continued, "You said you haven't found the place where you are whole, but you have. I saw it. I saw it when you read to my grandfather, when you picked jaboticabas, when you set the dishes for the party, when you stood in the kitchen after hearing my mother say things I will never forgive myself for allowing. You don't need a place to be whole, Selena. You already are. And I'm the idiot who almost let slip away the only person who made me feel whole too." The Martins' living room fell silent. Noemia, Renata, and Monica watched the scene as if watching something happening in a parallel universe, incomprehensible, impossible, but happening right there, before their eyes, on the sofa with its mismatched cushions, next to the old television. Selena. She looked at Raphael and saw in him something she hadn't seen before, vulnerability. The wealthy heir, the man in the expensive suit, the Drummond with broad shoulders and a clenched jaw was there in the simple room, with moist eyes and slightly trembling hands, asking not for permission, not for forgiveness, but only for a chance to prove that his love was the kind that doesn't back down. Selena didn't answer immediately. She stood there looking at him, and inside she felt as if entire years of contained pain were dissolving, not disappearing, because pain like that doesn't disappear, but transforming into something different, into ground, into fertile soil where something new could grow. She said, "And your family?" Raphael said, "They'll have to deal with it." She said, "It's not simple." He replied, "Nothing worthwhile is." Selena looked at her mother. Noemia had an expression her daughter had never seen before, a mixture of astonishment, confusion, and something that could very generously be called shame. Not shame about Selena, shame of herself. Because there, at that moment, under the harsh light of the Martins' living room, it became crystal clear that the daughter she had called ugly, the daughter she had pushed into the pantry, the daughter she had jokingly sent to serve old people at the party, was the daughter that someone with every reason in the world to choose anyone else had chosen, not despite who she was, but because of who she was. Raphael left the Martins' house that night with a promise. Not a promise of marriage, nor of eternal happiness, nor of anything that could be written in a contract. A promise of presence, of trying, of days, of seeing what would come of it. The following months were not easy. Raphael faced his mother, who alternated between veiled threats and punitive silence. There were family dinners where Sonia addressed everyone except Raphael, as if her son had become an empty space at the table. There were phone calls from worried aunts that began with, "We want what's best for you," and ended with, "You know this isn't going to work." There was his cousin Fabio, who, at a business meeting, commented, in a joking tone that no one found funny, that Raphael had traded caviar for jabuticaba. He faced his cousins, who made comments at family dinners, some malicious, others merely curious, all intrusive. He faced his own doubt, which appeared in the early hours of the morning when the world was quiet and the voices inside his head were loud. But he also found unexpected allies. His father, Ottavio, celebrated the news with the only display of emotion Selina ever saw him show. He lifted his felt hat and said, "Finally, someone in this family did something right." Donna Lourdes, who baked a cake without anyone asking and placed it on the balcony with 2 cups, and Donna Fernanda, the deaf great-aunt who called Raphael specifically to say, "That young woman who served me at the party is the best person that whole night. If I were 50 years younger and a man, I would have done the same thing." Selina, for her part, faced her own ghosts. The fear of not being enough, not for Raphael, but for the life he led. The fear that the love would end when the novelty wore off and he saw in her what his family had always seen, someone ordinary, without sparkle, without anything to justify the choice. The fear that her mother was right, that her sisters were right, that she, in a suit, was just the ugly one. These fears came in the early morning, when the farm was dark and the silence was too much for one person alone. Selina would wake up with her heart racing and lie there looking at the ceiling. No longer the ceiling with the damp stain, but the high ceiling of the farm with dark wooden beams and the old smell of history. And she would wonder, will he wake up tomorrow and realize he made a mistake? Will you look at me in the daylight and see what everyone else sees? Will you get tired of the girl from the cafe and the bookstore? There was one night when that fear became too great. Selina got up, went down to the kitchen, sat on the bench by the window and stared into the darkness outside. She heard footsteps in the hallway and saw Raphael appear in the doorway, his hair disheveled and his eyes showing he was also sleepless. He didn't ask what she was doing there. He sat beside her, leaned his shoulder against hers, and they both stared into the darkness, sharing their insomnia as they shared everything. In silence, in presence, with the naturalness of those who already understood that being together requires no explanation. After a while that neither of them measured, Selina said, almost whispering, "I'm afraid that one day you'll wake up and see what others see." Raphael turned to her and said, "I see what others don't see, and that's why I'm here." It wasn't a movie line. It wasn't a rehearsed statement. It was the simple truth of a man who had found, in the woman the world had discarded, everything the world had failed to give him. But these fears, which were old acquaintances, had for the first time met a worthy adversary. Not Raphael, although he was part of it, but Selina herself, the woman who woke up at 5 a.m. to prepare coffee that no one appreciated. The woman who read poems by candlelight to an old man who confused time. The woman who picked jaboticabas as if they were jewels. The woman who wrote a letter was being sent so that no one else would suffer. This woman, the real Selina, not the diminished version her family had created, was strong enough to accept being loved, and realizing this was, perhaps, the biggest turning point in her life. Not when Raphael appeared, but when she looked at herself and decided she deserved for him to stay. The relationship between Selina and Raphael was built like a solid house. Brick by brick, with patience, with mistakes corrected, with windows open to let in light and walls strong enough to protect from the wind. She didn't move to the farm immediately. She continued living in the Martins' house, continued working at the bookstore, continued taking care of Seu Ottavio. The difference was that now, when she returned home, there was a message on her phone. A goodnight that wasn't automatic, but thoughtful. And when she woke up at 5 a.m, she was no longer alone in the kitchen. Sometimes the phone would ring, and it would be Raphael, who also couldn't sleep. And they would sit in silence on the line, each on their side of town, sharing their insomnia and their mornings. The relationship with the family also changed, although not in the way the movies show. There was no grand reconciliation moment, no scene where Noemia begs forgiveness on her knees and her sisters embrace Selina crying. The reality was more discreet and more truthful. Noemia, confronted with the irrefutable evidence that she had underestimated her daughter for 24 years, reacted in the only way she knew how, with discomfort. She felt awkward when Raphael appeared. She offered too much coffee. She talked too much. She tried to compensate for years of neglect with clumsy acts of kindness that were, at the same time, insufficient and touching. Selina accepted it, not because she forgave everything. There were wounds that would need years to heal if they ever healed, but because she understood that Noemia was limited, not evil. and that expecting more from someone than that person can give is a form of violence against both of them. Renata and Monica wavered between envy and admiration, and Selina let them waver. It wasn't up to her to control what her sisters felt. It was up to her only to continue being who she was, the woman who made coffee at 5. In the mornings, she read poems to old people. She smiled with imperfect teeth and real dimples. If her sisters wanted to approach, the door was open. If they preferred to keep their distance, the door was still open. Selina was no longer going to close doors or hide behind flowered curtains. There was a Sunday, 3 months after that night in the Martins' living room, when Selina and Raphael returned to the orchard. The jaboticaba trees were laden with fruit. It was the season, and they picked fruit in silence, side by side, their fingers stained purple, the sun filtering through the leaves. At some point, Selina said, "When I was a child, I would look at the ceiling of my room and imagine a country where I would fit." Raphael looked at her and asked, "And did you find it?" Selina smiled, that whole smile with imperfect teeth and real dimples, and said, "I don't think it's a country, I think it's a person. And sometimes it's an orchard, and sometimes it's a veranda with coffee, and sometimes it's the silence on the phone line at 5 in the morning." Raphael took her hand, that hand that picked jaboticabas as if they were jewels, that prepared coffee in porcelain cups, that wrote letters in tiny handwriting, that held the hands of frightened old people in the dark, and brought it to his lips. He kissed her fingers one by one, slowly, as if making a promise with each touch. Seu Otavio died on a Tuesday in autumn, with his felt hat on his head, the blue cup on the bedside table, and Selina's hand holding his. He died as he wished, not alone in a room full of people, but accompanied in a silent room by someone who could see. Before closing his eyes for the last time, he looked at Selina and Raphael, who was on the other side of the bed, and said in a voice that was almost a whisper, "I asked life for one more love to see before I go. It gave me 2. Selina cried. Raphael cried. Dona Lourdes, who was at the door, cried. Even the pendulum clock in the living room seemed to have slowed down, as if marking time more carefully at that moment, knowing that something precious was leaving. At the funeral, the Drummond family gathered with the solemnity that money and tradition dictate. Sonia was there, dressed in black, with a composed expression of those who feel more than they show. The cousins, the aunts, the uncles, all present, all sizing each other up with that look that wealthy families develop when there's an inheritance at stake. Raphael stood beside his grandfather's coffin with Selina by his side. He didn't hide. He didn't push her away. He held her hand in front of everyone, and when someone looked with surprise or disapproval, he held their gaze with the same calm he had learned from her, the calm of someone who knows who they are and doesn't need anyone's permission to exist. After the burial, when the house was empty and the silence had that heavy texture that lingers after someone dies, Raphael opened Seu Otavio's will. The old man had left the farm, not to his children, not to his grandchildren, but under a joint usufruct agreement with Raphael and Selina. The clause stated, in the lawyer's formal words but with Seu Otavio's unmistakable spirit, so that the veranda may never be without coffee and the orchard may never be without someone to pick jaboticabas as if they were jewels. The Drummond family erupted. Sonia threatened legal action. The cousins spoke of absurdity and manipulation. Aunts who had never set foot on the farm appeared demanding explanations. Raphael faced them all with the serenity of someone who has finally found something worth fighting for. And Selina, by his side, faced them with the silent dignity that had always been her greatest strength, the same dignity her mother mistook for weakness, her sisters for apathy, and the world for insignificance. Months passed and the storm subsided, as all storms subside when they realize their target isn't moving. Sonia eventually accepted it, not wholeheartedly, perhaps never wholeheartedly, but mentally, because she was intelligent enough to recognize when a battle isn't worth fighting. The cousins gradually forgot, distracted by their own dramas and ambitions, and the farm, that enormous farm of coffee and jaboticaba trees, gradually became, brick by brick, the place Selina imagined when she looked at the stain on the ceiling. It wasn't a country. It was a balcony with 2 chairs and 2 cups of coffee. It was an orchard with a stone bench. It was a library with books of poems. It was a room where the candlelight cast shadows that told stories. It was the silence shared with someone who doesn't need words to be present. It was Raphael's hand in hers, early in the morning, when the sun rose behind the mountains, not behind a building as before, and the world seemed, for a moment, freshly washed anew. Selina continued working at the bookstore. She didn't need to. Raphael would have taken care of everything, but she needed a different way. She needed the smell of the books, the conversations with Seu Amaro, the back staircase where she spent her breaks reading with her bare feet against the wall. That Selina, the Selina of the bookstore, was as essential as the Selina of the farm. She was the same woman, whole in both places, without needing to diminish parts of herself to fit into either. And then there were the mornings when she would wake up, no longer at 5, but at 6, because now she could afford that luxury, and go down to the farmhouse kitchen, prepare the coffee in the blue cup that was now hers, place it on the tray with the bread cut into equal slices and the folded napkins, and take it to the veranda where Raphael was already waiting, sitting in the chair that had belonged to Seu Otavio, with a book in his lap that he pretended to read, but which was actually just a pretext to be there, in that place at that time, with her. And every morning before sitting down, Selina would stop for a second and look at the horizon, the coffee plantations stretching to the mountains, the sky slowly brightening, the birds beginning to sing, and she would feel something that had no name but was greater than any word. It was the exact opposite of the stain on the ceiling. It was the exact opposite of the pantry. It was the exact opposite of her sister's laughter, her mother's indifference, the comments at the party, the flowered curtain separating her from the rest of the world. It was a sense of belonging, not belonging to a place, to a person, to a family, belonging to herself. The final, unwavering certainty that Selina Martins was not ugly, was not insignificant, was not the one nobody chose. Selina Martins was the woman an 85-year-old man recognized as the best thing that ever happened to his home. The woman a rich and lonely man chose, not despite who she was, but because of who she was. The woman who prepared coffee as if setting up an altar and picked ciabatta cabas as if picking something sacred. The woman who wrote letters in tiny handwriting and read poems by candlelight. The woman who looked at stains on the ceiling and saw countries. The woman who chose who she wanted to be and didn't let anyone choose for her. Raphael would look at her every morning on the veranda and see what he had always seen since that first time in the farmhouse kitchen. Not beauty in the way the world understands it, but beauty in the way that matters. Genuine, unexpected, impossible to ignore once you see it. And every morning, when she sat beside him and the sun shone on her face, on her small, sparkling eyes, and on her smile with its imperfect teeth and real dimples, he thought the same thing. The family sent their ugly daughter as a joke, and she became the love of my life. Selina never heard Raphael think that, but she knew. She knew in the same way she knew the coffee was ready by the sound of the kettle, that the sun was going to rise by the color of the sky, that the rain was coming by the smell of the earth. I knew with my whole body, with that instinct that invisible people develop to survive, and that when they find someone who sees them, transforms into something different, no longer an instinct for survival, but an instinct for life. And what existed between them on that veranda, in that orchard, on that farm of coffee and ciabatta cava trees was life. Not a perfect life. There were difficult days, arguments, fears that returned in the early morning, wounds that itched when the weather changed, but a true life. A life in which each cup of coffee was an act of love, each silence a conversation, and each sunrise proof that the world, despite everything, despite all the contempt and all the pain and all the loneliness, he was still capable of producing something worthwhile. And on the last page of this story, which isn't the last, because true stories don't end, they just find a point where they can breathe. Selina is on the balcony. The sun rises, the coffee gets cold. Raphael holds her hand. And somewhere, in a back room of a simple house in a tree-lined alley, a damp stain on the ceiling keeps growing every time it rains. But Selina doesn't look at it anymore, because he discovered that he didn't need an imaginary country to fit into. He only needed eyes that could see, and he found them.